Right, so getting us started today, I would like to obviously introduce myself and give Katie the opportunity to introduce herself as well. But a bit of background about what we're talking about today. We are looking at the Australian early childhood sector, the different governing bodies that we have in place and the purpose of each of those. But we're also looking at how this is relevant to us and our research. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Emma Cross. I'm a research assistant with the Digital Child team at Curtin University. At the moment, I'm working across most projects, and I'm also doing my own PhD outside of the Digital Child, but focusing on leadership and governance as well in the early childhood sector. So I'll just hand over to Katie to introduce herself now.
Thanks, Emma. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Katie Fielding. I'm one of the PhD students at the Curtin node of the Digital Child. My research is focused mostly on the way that parent and educator attitudes and practices influence the way that young children are using digital technologies for creativity.
Thanks, Katie. So for today's seminar, we've got a few things that we're going to go through. Firstly, we'll talk about a bit of an overview of the sector itself. We're also going to look at how to speak about the sector, looking at the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child, and with that the Early Childhood Australia Codes of Ethics. We're also going to look at those governing frameworks and the quality assurance processes and dive into all of that a little bit more as well. So a bit of an overview of the sector to get us started. Basically, the early childhood sector has been really transforming under a reform agenda that was initiated in 2007. That shift was really in response to Australia's unsatisfactory rating in the OECD rankings, where we were scored 24th out of 25 progressive countries. So as I'm sure you can imagine, that's not quite what we would hope for. We also went through this reform agenda and continue to go through this agenda in response to the growing understanding of the importance of early childhood education in a child's development and learning. And it was also recognised at this time that there was disjointed regulation across government, frameworks and all of that sort of stuff as well. So as an outcome of this, we saw the introduction of quite a few different frameworks and governing bodies as well. So there were new bodies introduced to really oversee how everything is implemented and running. So with that, we saw the national laws and regulations coming into effect. We saw the introduction of the Education and Care Regulatory Unit, which we more affectionately refer to as ECRA. We saw the National Quality Framework, the Early Years Learning Framework. We also then have different frameworks for different ages of children, but predominantly in early childhood centres, we're looking at the EYLF and the WA Kindergarten Guidelines as well, which actually come under the state curriculum. So, like all things, we can't really get too far unless we know actually how to speak about the sector, and this is something that has been changing as the sector continues to move along that pathway to professionalism. So Early Childhood Australia actually developed a resource, and there's also a article about how we should speak about the sector and the different types of terminology that need to be used. This was really introduced in response to outdated language that was being observed, in reference to the sector and within the sector. And it's really important for us as researchers and educators ourselves to understand this terminology so that we ensure what we're doing is promoting that professionalism and we're, respecting the work that's being done within that sector. So a big one here, we don't say kids anymore, we say children. They're not childcare workers or child carers. They're educators or early childhood teachers. They're not referred to as daycare centres anymore, despite being long day care in terms of the type of service that's offered. We refer to these in many different ways, but predominantly early childhood services is more encompassing of all of the different types. And then we also don't refer to it as an industry anymore, and instead it's the early childhood sector or us as a profession. So it's, like I said, it's really important that we are aware of those different terminologies so we can make sure that we're speaking the same language. Sorry, hopefully you can't hear Frank. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was also something that really heavily underpins what we do and the work that we do. This was introduced 30 years ago, and it's basically an international agreement about childhood and how we can respect the rights of those children. It is the most widely approved human rights treaty, and its intention is to really enhance the lives of young children. It does have 42 articles within this, and you can see that neat graphic sort of shows all of those different areas. But what we're really interested in here is actually comment 25, as that focuses on children's rights in relation to the digital environment. And by that, we want to make sure that we're providing guidance on the legislation, policy, and all of the types of measures that we need to ensure children's rights are being met within the digital environment. Something that sits alongside that and has more explicitly has been developed for early childhood services is the ECA Code of Ethics. ECA is one of our, or Early Childhood Australia is one of our national governing bodies that's more of an organisation as such. Each state has their own separate branch as well. So I am actually a member of the Western Australian branch and overseeing Leadership in Early Years Committee as the chair. So with the ECA Code of Ethics, basically it's a document that guides what we do, and it informs our decision making and allows us to recognise those ethical considerations that we need to be making. Now, in this document, there are a few things that we come across that are specific to early childhood technology use and how that could potentially also influence our research. So I have pulled them out for you here. One of the first things that we need to do is make sure that the learning environments that we're creating support children's agency and also enhance their learning. And as you can see, that really closely aligns to the UN rights of the child as well. So in terms of the ways that we're using digital technologies, we obviously want to be using them in a meaningful way that allows children to express their own thoughts and opinions as well. In terms of the research side of things, we also need to be aware of the impacts that our research can have on children and ensuring that we are gathering that informed consent like Katie spoke about in our last session. So this comes into the Code of Ethics, where we need to ensure that we are really making clear and accurate judgments of a child's participation and their interest in research, considering things like their levels of fatigue, their interest, and also their privacy and safety. So even if a child is saying, yes, I'm happy to participate, it may be that now is not a good time for them and we need to reapproach this at another time. It also talks about safeguarding information that relate to children and the documentation of that, particularly when it's in an online environment. Typically in early childhood services, we do use a lot of digital documentation and ways to store things like enrolment information, vaccinations, all sorts of really confidential information is stored online. So it's really important that as services we're aware of how to safeguard that information, but for researchers to also be aware that that's taking place and how we can also protect the data privacy through our research as well, and how we're sharing that data. We also need to make sure that we're using our research to advocate for a society where all children have access to quality education and care. And I think that's really ultimately what all of our research comes back to, is ensuring that the purpose of what we're doing is meaningful and it's not, for our own self-interest and to get some more publications. It's really and truly about transforming quality education in the early years sector. Now, in terms of governing frameworks, they are kind of structured in a way that they flow into one another. So the first thing that we have at the highest level is the national laws and regulations. So there we have the Education and Care Services National Law, and we also have the Education and Care Services National Regulations. Those laws and regulations sit above the National Quality Framework, and the National Quality Framework really unpacks that and shows how we can embody that and enact that in an early years service. So obviously flowing on from that, we do have this National Quality Framework, and that in itself is quite broad and all-encompassing. So it has actually 7 quality areas that sit within those standards. You've got there for quality area 1, you have education program and practice. Quality area 2, you've got children's health and safety. 3 is physical environment. 4 is staffing arrangements. 5 is relationships with children. 6 is collaborative partnerships with families and communities. And 7 is governance and leadership. Within those quality areas, there are lots of different things that guide the ways that we work and how we perform in early years services. And it's actually a way that we are rated for our level of quality in the early childhood sector. And I will talk about that a little bit later. Coming out of Quality Area 1 more specifically, which is our education program and practice, we do also have the Early Years Learning Framework. Within the EYLF, we have 5 learning outcomes that sit within this, and those again kind of guide the way that we embody and we develop our educational programs and our practices. I guess to some extent you could consider that the EYLF is a version of curriculum designed for children aged birth to 8 years of age. So here we have outcome 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and each of those in very different ways encompass digital technologies and the works that we're doing as well. So when we're looking at the EYLF, this quote comes explicitly out of that document, and this is actually how they've defined technologies. So it says, it includes much more than computers and digital technologies used for information, communication, and entertainment. Technologies are the diverse range of products that make up the designed world. These products extend beyond artifacts designed and developed by people and include processes, systems, services, and environments. So as I've said, this is the way that technologies are defined within the EYLF, and as you can see, it is quite broad there as well, and it draws in technologies beyond just the digital environment. Now, when we're looking at the digital environment and digital technologies in those environments, it really talks about, the EYLF talks about how we can use digital technologies within the learning environment to promote and encourage creativity and our new ways of thinking. And I won't touch on creativity too much because I know Katie's going to talk about that in a little bit. Looking at digital technologies, these really come into outcomes 4.4 and 5.5, and we see that where children are encouraged to resource their own learning through connecting with technologies. So this is where children will have the opportunity to, become curious and engage with these technologies for experimentation, and to also investigate and solve problems that they've come across as well. We also see this in outcome 5.5, where children use technologies to access information, investigate their ideas, and also represent their thinking. Typically, outcome 5 focuses on language development and a child's ability to convey messages. So this really focuses on how digital technologies can be used as a form of communication. So there we see children understanding the different uses of technologies and using them in that appropriate manner. Using the technologies to access information and make sense of the world around them. They also use it as a tool, again, for conveying that communication, and that can really look quite different based on the age of the child. So, you may have a pre-literate child that will use things like drawing tools or potentially use photos to create their own storyboards as a form of communication, whereas you may then have a school-aged child that still sits within the EYLF who would be using these digital technologies to, who would be using these technologies to potentially document their own thinking with something more like a storybook that they're creating online. We also like to see that young children are using digital technologies for fun and to make meaning. So that's really important, and again, that comes explicitly from outcome 5.5. Now, looking at the National Quality Framework, there are 3 quality areas that explicitly talk about digital technologies and technologies more generally as well, in that sense where they don't have to be digital. So within Quality Area 3, we actually look at the physical environment and the way that those environments are being set up conducive of young children's learning and development. So here we see the NQF talking about using digital technologies to support that sort of experimentation and really facilitating the achievement of those learning outcomes within the EYLF. We also see access to appropriate tools and technologies that really enhance children's learning as well. So that's where it's really important that educators are being quite critical in the types of technologies that they're introducing into their learning environments. Now, this one's quite interesting, at least from my perspective. Quality Area 4 looks at staffing arrangements, which, you may typically think it's not really as relevant to our sort of research and what we're looking at. However, Services with fewer than 25 children can actually engage with an early childhood teacher exclusively online. So the number of teachers required in each early childhood service is actually dependent on the number of children they have enrolled on a particular day, and that then dictates the number of hours that staff member needs to work and all of those HR type things. But interestingly for us in our research, and something that may be, food for further thought, is that services with less than 25 children only have to engage with a qualified teacher online. Now, looking at Quality Area 7, that's governance and leadership. So in there, we're looking at how digital technologies can be used for the availability of information for that administration type of work. So that's where you have, your enrollment forms, you've got all of the health information of the children, all of that type of more admin type things. We also then use the ICT for things like your planning, evaluation and communication, and all of those tasks that we undertake really then underpin Quality Area 1, where we're looking at that education program and practice. And we really see that as Quality Area 7 exclusively focuses on the educational leader and how they're guiding the achievement of Quality Area 1. As I briefly touched on before, we do have a means for actually rating services in Australia, across the country, and these are all rated by the Education and Care Regulatory Unit, or ECRU, like I've previously mentioned. All services go through an assessment and rating process. At the moment, it's not been a specific time, lapse in time before they have to re-undertake assessment. Previously, the higher your rating, the less frequently you were assessed, and the lower your rating, the more regularly you were assessed. But I do believe that in the latest government announcements, they have stated that services will undergo assessment and rating at a maximum of 4 years, which is going to be a much quicker turnaround than what we have been seeing, particularly through this COVID climate. So through this process, ECRU actually come out and they rate and assess services against those 7 quality areas within the National Quality Framework. And each service puts together a quality improvement plan, or a QIP, which supports that process. So in that document, the service will outline things like areas for improvement, but also areas where they have strength and they're doing things quite well. Quality ratings in Australia do range across 5 different ratings. The lowest rating that can be awarded is significant improvement required. All services rated significant improvement required work closely alongside ECRU to improve the service that they are providing. They have 12 months to make significant change before certain actions come into place. Generally, the lowest ratings that we see more commonly are working towards, and that basically means the service isn't quite yet achieving the quality standards, but they're making significant grounds to get towards that meeting level. In 2017, the National Quality Framework was revised, and at this time, services that were previously known for being exceeding services actually came down a level and became meeting, because the expectations became a lot higher. So nowadays, what we're seeing is a lot more services coming through at that meeting level. However, you do also get those exceeding services, which really highlights and emphasises the quality of service that they are putting forward. So to be an exceeding service, again, you're basically taking the quality framework and the different areas that you're being rated against, and you're going above and beyond what is expected of you. And there are certain, tasks and areas that need to be achieved to be awarded that rating. Now, the highest level of accreditation in Australia is that excellent rating. And this rating is really important because it's actually a separate review process that services have to go under to be awarded this rating. So typically a service will be awarded, say, exceeding in all 7 quality areas, and then what they'll do is they'll apply to go for that excellence, which is another accreditation on top of what they've already been through. So services that have been awarded excellent are far and few between, and they are the best centres that we have in the country. At the moment in WA, we don't have any significant improvement required services, and we also have no excellent services. So we're generally sitting between that working towards to exceeding rating. All of this information is also publicly available, and it is accessed through a Sequa's website and service lookup, but I'm more than happy to provide guidance to access service ratings and all of that information. I would like to now hand over to Katie, though, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about creativity and digital technologies.
Thanks, Emma. I'm just seeing in my picture that it's a bit dark, so I apologize if you can't see me very well. So Emma's given you a great overview of the NQS and the Early Years Learning Framework. And I just wanted to sort of focus on the aspects of creativity and digital technologies that we see in those two documents, or maybe to sort of telegraph a little bit the lack of what we see about digital technologies and creativity in those documents. So as Emma pointed out, particularly in the Early Years Learning Framework, but I think also in the NQS, that definition of digital technologies, or technologies, I should say, is really quite broad. And I think given that digital isn't part of that, I suspect that this is part of the way that centres are able to sort of skirt around not incorporating digital technologies as much as maybe I personally would like to see, or to the extent to which it's possible. So as Emma said, particularly quality areas 1, 2, and 3 are, in my mind, where this is sort of particularly relevant. And as you saw on those previous slides, you know, there is some mention of technologies in these quality areas, but not a huge amount, I'd have to say. And a lot of it, I think, is much more implied than it is explicit. As an example, quality area 2, when we're looking at children being protected, you know, I suspect that Sinead would probably have lots to say about this particular area, given that we would hope to be seeing the child protected in the online space, not just in the physical space, for example, but whether or not centres have explicit policy and documentation and actions and procedures that actually explicitly work with digital technologies and protecting children. I'm not sure that that's perhaps as well done as it is for, say, the physical environment. So I think there are there's a lot of space for improvement in terms of thinking about digital technologies and digital spaces in early learning environments. I would also say, if we look at quality area 1, where we're looking at educational program and practice, again, there's a lot that's implied here, you know, particularly in terms of the program enhancing children's learning and their development, facilitating and extending their learning and development. Now, we could certainly read into that should include developing their creativity, for example, but the lack of explicit mention, I think, in some ways makes it easy for us to forget that, and in some ways sort of devalues that important area of children's development. Emma, could you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. So this is the Early Years Learning Framework here, and looking particularly again at outcome 4 and 5, like Emma mentioned earlier. I see it as a lot more explicit in terms of the way that creativity and digital technologies are included in this document. But again, it's very much open to interpretation when we're looking at digital technologies. You know, the mention in outcome 5 there of children using information and communications technologies is quite a sort of specific type of technology, ICTs, to access information, to investigate, to represent thinking. But if you look at some of those other dot points there, and this is coming directly out of those documents, things like beginning to understand symbols and pattern systems, engaging with a range of text to gain meaning, and so on. You know, we could scratch into this and think that, well, that's sort of about computational thinking, there's systems thinking, and so on there, which are all really important in terms of using digital technologies, and digital technologies giving us access or a way into developing those things. But realistically, of those 5 dot points there, the only sort of specific mention of digital technologies is ICTs. And I think this leaves out a whole range of potential digital technologies that could enhance children's learning that are outside of ICTs. When we look at outcome 4, children are confident and involved learners, this is, I think, where creativity is explicitly mentioned. I mean, you can see it in that first dot point there, that they develop dispositions for learning, such as curiosity, cooperation, confidence, creativity, and so on. But what I think is really interesting here is the way that creativity has been, I guess, relegated to another disposition for learning. And also the way that much of what is in that dot point is part of creativity itself. So we would think about curiosity and persistence and imagination and reflexivity as being involved in children being creative thinkers. But the way that it's separated out there into being another one of those dispositions, I think highlights the lack of clarity we have, and this is a big we, we with a capital W, I guess, that lack of clarity we have as to what creativity actually is. And when we don't have that clarity, well, then it becomes more and more difficult for educators to really consciously think about, well, how do I develop that? If I don't know exactly what it is, well, how do I, change my practice or involve other resources or be really mindful in my education of children in order to develop that? So I think it highlights, as I say, that lack of across the board understanding of what creativity really is. I was also just this morning actually reading a paper written by Nicole Leggett a few years ago now, but it was really interesting that she noted that because of the way that creativity isn't defined in this document, it really devalues it. She was sort of suggesting that that lack of clear sense of what creativity is takes it away from being particularly important. It's just putting it in a list. And I think that's something that we as a group broadly can sort of reflect upon about how do we help develop that understanding of creativity and what it means in an early learning context. I also note that in the early years learning framework, what we often get is creative arts as a, capital C, capital A, creative arts. And again, I think this is problematic in that it contributes to that stereotype that creativity belongs in the arts, that creativity is something that has to do with art and drama and music. And I've missed one there. Anyway, and that if we keep I've lost my train of thought, I apologize. But if we keep thinking about creativity as being highly connected to the arts, then we can easily miss out on all the other opportunities for where we can help nurture creativity in young children. Okay, last slide, please, Emma. Thank you. So that leads me on to where we've done some research here, a systematic literature review that was really about looking for evidence of that intersection of early learning, creativity, and technologies, about how technologies may be able to help us to see creativity happening, and how it can help us to develop that creativity as well. And my cute little Venn diagram down the bottom there, gives a sense of, often we see research that's about creativity and early learning. We often see early learning and technologies, but we don't often see that nexus of creativity, technologies, and early learning and what's going on in that space. So the systematic literature review that we conducted was to look for, well, what is out there in terms of the research of these 3 things together. And the findings were that there's not much at the moment. So in the period between 2010 and 2020, we found 19 papers that discussed evidence of creativity, technologies, and early learning. what was really interesting to me is that much of the research that we found related to coding and robotics. Now, in terms of this review, the early learning was defined as 4 to 8 year olds. So this encompasses some primary school areas as well as early learning centres. But we found most of it was to do with coding and robotics. And I suspect partly that may be because of the way that it's explicitly mentioned in Australian curriculum documents, where they use examples such as coding and robotics. So again, also those digital technologies provide a lot of fertile ground for problem solving and other creative pursuits. So it makes sense. But I found it super interesting that none of these papers looked at smartphone technology in early learning in terms of developing and demonstrating creativity. And the reason I think that's so interesting is that smartphones are largely, not across the board, but they're largely ubiquitous in young children's lives. It's such a common thing for them. And when you think about the power of a smartphone, this tiny little thing that fits in your pocket is lightweight, you carry it anywhere, and the vast array of things that smartphone can be. It's not just a phone, but it's also a camera and a voice recorder and a light meter, and it's a video recorder, and it's a compass, and it's an augmented reality of the night sky, and it's all of these different things in one device. And so it's very interesting to me that that is something that isn't being looked at the moment, at least in this review, with young children. And I wondered if perhaps there is some, I guess, attitude towards smartphones as being something that we restrict children from, rather than thinking about how we can use them to augment their learning. But the findings we did come up with from this systematic review is that there is a huge potential for technologies to facilitate and augment the development of creativity in early learning. Of those 19 papers, 17 of them gave us evidence of creative behaviours. That when children were using these technologies, they were demonstrating problem solving or connecting between the digital and the physical, say with their bodies, for example, where they were demonstrating agency in terms of deciding what their goal would be and how they would get there. They demonstrating things like persistence and resilience and so on. We also found that there was a huge importance of the affordances of technologies when we're talking about early learning settings. Things like the size and the weight of technologies that we use are really important when we're talking about very young children. Also, the way that these technologies can provide social opportunities, that they're not just head down individual activities, but that they provide children with opportunities to play and talk and problem solve together and share ideas. That's a really important thing when it comes to children being able to demonstrate creativity when using technologies. The level of literacy and numeracy required for a particular app or a particular program or a particular device is really important when we're talking about young children who may be at pre-reading levels. And all sorts of things to do with those affordances. The other really important thing that we found was the role of the educator is crucial. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here about how important educators are in early learning in all facets of that. But when it comes to technologies, the role of the educator is really important. These aren't just things that we hand over to children and say, have at it. There's absolutely a role for the educator to invite questioning, to provide provocations, to guide, to mentor, to scaffold, to encourage and motivate as well. And I guess it brings me to some of the questions that are in my mind about, well, why do we often not see technologies being embraced in early learning? I think partly this may be to do with a fear that we just invite children to be individual and to have their head down and to not be interacting. But as I said, that the things we were finding in these papers were that there are so many opportunities for social interaction, for co-creating and for sharing and so on. So if anybody who's listening to the recording is interested in that paper, the systematic review, the reference is there on the screen, but I'm also very happy to send it through to you via email if you need that. So please get in touch if you would like it. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of to the research that we've started doing in this space, in the technologies, early learning and creativity space. And I'll hand back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Katie. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. That's just a bit of a brief overview in terms of the complexities of the sector, to say the least. And thank you again, Katie, for sharing some insights into your systematic review as well.